They thought I wouldn't show. That I'd sit this one out. Move on. Stay quiet. But I didn't just RSVP. I bought the venue. The invitation lay on the marble counter, catching the soft spill of spring light through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Charleston in April was always kind to mornings like this: clean air, still breeze, no apologies. It was a thick envelope, too elegant for what it contained. White with gold trim embossed lettering that caught the light in an almost artificial way. Whoever ordered these spent time on appearances. Nathan always did. I ran my finger along the edge, not opening it just yet. My glass of Malbec from the night before sat untouched beside it. The wine had gone stale, but the moment hadn't. There was still something satisfying about the scent, darker than sweet, close to bitter. Familiar. The voicemail had come first, of course. Margaret's voice, trying too hard to sound graceful. "Vivian, darling. I hope this finds you well. We'd be honored if you could join us for Nathan's special day. You've always been part of this family. I mean that." Click. No stuttering, no emotion. Just rehearsed hospitality covered in magnolia syrup pleasantries. The kind that never really lets you forget your place. 4 years ago, I left their world with one suitcase and no goodbye. No one stopped me. No one chased. Now they were sending gold-trimmed invitations as if nothing ever broke. And what a setting they chose: St. Gabriel's Cathedral. The same stone aisle where I once stood in ivory silk, where Margaret dabbed fake tears with a pearl-handled handkerchief and whispered, "You'll make him better." Where Nathan had looked at me like I was a promise he didn't quite believe in. Now they were inviting me back. And not just to attend, they had listed me as a special guest of honor. I smiled, sharp and slow. It wasn't the kind of smile people posted on Facebook. It was the kind that curled just slightly when history forgot who wrote the first draft. I slid the invitation open with one clean motion. Inside was a tri-folded card, textured and thick as if weight could make it feel more meaningful. Their names centered in a calligraphy font that tried too hard. Nathaniel Alden and Carly Whitman, joined together with an ampersand, too wide, too gold, too smug. St. Gabriel's. Saturday, May 25th, 4:00 p.m. Formal attire. Reception to follow at the Mariners' Hall. My name was printed separately below the guest list. Miss Vivian Hartstone. Special guest of honor. I stared at the phrase. Let it hover, let it hum. There was no mistaking it. No typo. No casual error. This was intentional. A performance. Footsteps entered the space behind me, soft leather against oak floors. Elias always moved like a man raised among libraries, quiet but never unnoticed. "You're up early," he said, his voice still warm with morning roughness. "Or did you just not sleep?" I didn't turn to face him right away. I let him take in the scene, the wine, the envelope, the Charleston harbor glowing behind me like a postcard come to life. "It came," I said simply. He stepped closer, picked up the envelope, turned it over once in his hand. "And they put your name on it. Front and center." "They always liked optics," I replied. He chuckled low and dry. "You think they meant to honor you or humiliate you?" I finally looked at him. Elias Hart, my business partner, my co-founder, my reason for not burning every bridge when I left. He knew when to talk, when to stay still. Today, he chose stillness. "I don't care what they meant," I said. "I care what I'll do with it." Elias nodded like he understood that wasn't a threat. It was a timeline. "You going?" he asked. "I already did," I replied. And it was true. The moment I saw their names together, the venue, the audacity, it stopped being an invitation. It became a declaration. And I had already answered. Not with words, but with the name on the deed to Mariners' Hall. Elias leaned against the kitchen island, arms folded. His shirt was still half-buttoned, collar relaxed, the way he always dressed when the world hadn't quite started spinning yet. So he said, slow and even, "What do you want from this?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for the wineglass, turned it in place. The rim still held a faint print, not mine. A smudge of lipstick, pale mauve. Subtle. Soft. The kind Carly used to wear when she came by for dinner parties back when she was just Carly. Nathan's coworker. My shadow. Once I curled her hair before a gala. She sat in my dressing room, cross-legged like a little sister, watching me through the mirror with too much admiration and too little shame. "You make everything look so easy," she'd said, eyes shining. At the time I thought it was a compliment. I smiled, handed her a gold clip from my vanity. What I didn't know was that she wasn't studying my style. She was studying my script. I looked back at Elias now. "I want closure," I said. Publicly. Elias tilted his head. "You sure you're not chasing vindication? I don't need revenge." "That's loud." I tapped the envelope with one finger. "This is quiet, clean." There was something about saying it out loud here in the stillness of morning that made it real. My reflection in the glass window wasn't the woman who walked away 4 years ago. That version of me had cracked blood, begged only once, but enough. The woman now had steel beneath her skin. Not because she wanted to fight, but because she had learned to survive without being seen. Elias picked up his mug from the counter, sipped, then added, "So you'll go. Smile. Shake hands." I nodded. "And watch." He didn't press further. That was the thing about Elias, he never poked at wounds unless asked. Instead, he rinsed his mug, left it in the sink, and walked toward the door like his part in the scene was complete. But just before stepping out, he paused. "They'll underestimate you," he said, glancing back. Again. I met his eyes. "That's the idea." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the room still, almost weightless. The hum of the harbor drifted in gulls, soft waves brushing the dock, the occasional creak of a sailboat shifting with the tide. I turned back to the counter. The invitation still sat there, open and smug. I pulled out the RSVP card and flipped it over. The standard checkboxes stared up at me. Joyfully accepts, regretfully declines. Neither fit. So I picked up my pen and wrote something else in the margin, my own box, my own answer. Attending. Looking forward to celebrating what you've built with borrowed parts. I slid the card back into its envelope with care, sealing it with the same calm precision I used in boardrooms when signing contracts that would change the direction of a company without ever raising my voice. Then I walked to the small silver case near the bookshelf. Inside was a flash drive, simple and clean. I'd labeled it in sharp black ink weeks ago, though I hadn't known exactly when I'd use it. Reception copy. Play when prompted. I set it beside the envelope like a matching accessory paper, and proof, one silent, one explosive. There were no grand declarations. No ominous music. Just the rustle of paper, the soft click of plastic, and the faint sound of waves outside. This wasn't revenge, it was documentation. And I intended to let it speak louder than I ever would. I gathered the envelope and the flash drive, slid both into my leather satchel. It fit snug between folders and a bound copy of the quarterly report Elias and I would review later that day. Life had kept moving. I had too. But that didn't mean the past was buried. It meant I chose where to carry it. Before heading out, I paused by the front window. The harbor glimmered in the soft light. A lone sailboat drifted past, its white sail catching just enough wind to move but not enough to race. I touched the rim of the wineglass one last time, smudging the ghost of that lipstick print until it vanished. Closure wasn't just about confronting what was. Sometimes it was about confirming what you'd become. On my way out, I slipped the RSVP into the mailbox downstairs, the kind that clicked with finality. One drop, one decision, one trigger quietly pulled. And just like that, the countdown had begun. At the curb, my driver waited, engine soft, eyes forward. He opened the door as I approached. "Where to Miss Hartstone?" he asked. I slid in, smoothed my coat, and said with the calm I'd rehearsed in my head for weeks. "To the printer. I want the place cards reviewed one last time." He blinked. "Place cards?" I turned to him, voice low, measured. "It's my venue. My guest list. My rules." He nodded and pulled away from the curb. As the car moved through the quiet Charleston streets, I didn't look back. Not at the harbor, not at the condo, not at the woman I used to be. Because this wasn't about the wedding. It was about what would happen after they said I do. The bell at St. Gabriel's tolled noon. It didn't echo the way it used to, maybe because the city had gotten louder or maybe because I'd gotten quieter. Either way, the sound didn't shake me. I stood across the street from the cathedral, now watching from behind the tinted window of my car. The sandstone arches were the same. The white marble steps still gleamed with that too clean polish they reserved for weddings and funerals. 8 years ago, I stood on those steps in silk heels and a veil my mother insisted on pinning herself. The florist was late. My sister had a fever. But Nathan had smiled when I walked down the aisle, and I had mistaken that for love. Now I watched a different woman step out of a town car flanked by wedding planners. Carly. Her dress wasn't white ivory, maybe with silver beading at the shoulders. Her hair was swept into that same side bun she'd once complimented me for at a benefit dinner, saying it was effortless. Her walk was confident, almost too confident, as if daring the ghosts of the past to stop her. But I wasn't a ghost. I was on the RSVP list. "Ma'am," my driver said gently, "would you like me to circle back later?" "No," I said. "Let's park." He pulled into a reserved spot behind the cathedral. My name was on the vendor contract. It gave me access, and access was everything. As I stepped out, a breeze caught my coat, lifting its edge just enough to remind me of the thin line between ceremony and strategy. I wasn't here to reclaim anything. I was here to observe the handoff and make sure no one forgot who the first bride was. Inside, the cathedral still smelled like polished wood and lilies. The same vaulted ceilings, the same stained glass windows filtering light into soft reds and blues. Time hadn't changed the architecture, just the names in the program. I walked slowly down the side aisle unnoticed. Most eyes were turned toward the front, where florists buzzed like bees adjusting floral arches that framed the altar. The organist practiced something baroque and forgettable. No one looked twice at me. Not yet. That was the trick. People forget who you are when you stop being the loudest one in the room. But quiet didn't mean invisible, it meant selective. Near the front pews, Margaret Alden stood giving instructions to a pair of interns holding a monogrammed seating chart. Her voice carried all syrup and tension. She wore a peach blazer with too many pearl buttons and a smile so tight it could hold a martini glass steady. I hadn't seen her in 4 years. But her voice, it had never left my head. Vivian always preferred cool tones, she once said to a reporter during a charity gala, but Nathan's warmth brought out the best in her. It wasn't praise, it was positioning. Today her son was marrying the woman who used to sit beside me at brunch, claiming she could never wear white without feeling like a fraud. I guess she got over that. I slid into the last pew, 3rd row from the back. No one saw me. I preferred it that way. In my coat pocket was the place card I'd had printed: Vivian Hartstone, guest of honor. It wasn't on their official list, but the table arrangements had been handled through my event company. I'd made sure the cardstock matched perfectly. A hushed laugh echoed from the side hall. I didn't turn. I knew that laugh. It was Nathan's, lower than I remembered, edged now with something rehearsed. He entered with his best man and a coordinator trailing behind, clipboard in hand. His tuxedo jacket rested over one shoulder like a magazine cover cliché. He looked polished, controlled. But not the kind of control that comes from self-assurance. No, this was the tension of someone managing an image tightly, nervously, as if one misstep might let the truth seep through his teeth. For a second, I let myself watch him. The way he adjusted his cuff. How he leaned in to check the floral centerpiece as if he actually cared. The way he smiled at Carly when she peeked out from a side alcove. I used to think that smile was mine. Not in a possessive sense, more like, I thought I'd earned it. All the late-night talks, the compromises, the small invisible work of making someone feel like they belonged. I now understood some people aren't meant to belong. They're meant to perform. Nathan caught a glimpse of something in the far aisle. His eyes flicked toward me for just half a second. I didn't flinch, didn't nod. I let him wonder. Did she come? Did she see? Does she know? I could feel the questions move across his face like shadows from the stained glass. I didn't answer them. Not with a look, not with a breath. Just silence. Then I rose slowly, smoothed the hem of my coat, and walked purposefully toward the back exit. Not out of fear, but to remind him I chose when and how I would be seen. Let him stew in the space I left behind. In the vestry, I found the event coordinator hunched over a clipboard muttering about candles and aisle runners. "Excuse me," I said gently. She looked up startled. "Oh ma'am, this area's restricted to wedding staff and family." I smiled, soft but steady. "Good. I'm both." She hesitated, trying to place me. The name didn't surface, but the tone must have triggered something in her spine because she straightened fast. "I just need to confirm the music cues," I added, holding up a small velvet pouch. Inside wasn't anything musical. It was a flash drive. Not the one. That was still in safekeeping. But this one contained a decoy copy of a slideshow Carly had once co-curated for a charity auction. Glowing quotes, recycled stock photos, and a few shots of her and Nathan looking like a political couple in training. It was meant to lull. Because the real content, the file labeled reception copy. Play when prompted. That would only appear when everything looked perfect. I handed the pouch to the coordinator. "For the AV team," I said, "slide deck for the reception, bride approved. Don't let it play too early." She nodded, still unsure, but she took it. People rarely question certainty delivered in silk. As I turned to leave, I passed the doorway to the bridal prep suite. The door was cracked. Inside, Carly stood before a mirror adjusting her neckline alone. She didn't see me. But I watched her watching herself, and in that moment, I didn't feel anger or regret. I felt anticipation. She'd taken my place. I just hoped she understood what came with it. I stepped outside before she could turn. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the cathedral courtyard. Tourists passed with cameras slung around their necks, unaware that history, personal, quiet, unrecorded, was happening just beyond the stained glass. Back at the curb, Elias was leaning against the car, arms folded, his sunglasses reflecting the sky. He didn't ask if I was ready. He knew better. Instead, he opened the door wordless. I slipped inside and exhaled, only then realizing I'd been holding my breath since the organist hit his first chord. As the car eased away, I glanced once, just once, at the spire. It looked different now. Not like a church. More like a stage. A place where parts were played, vows were read, and masks were worn just long enough for everyone to believe. I wasn't in the cast anymore, but I'd written the final act. And the next time I stepped into that cathedral, they wouldn't just remember I was the first bride, they'd remember why I came back. The morning after the rehearsal, I found myself standing in front of a gallery wall I hadn't seen in years. It was inside a boutique hotel downtown, the Mariner's House, where Nathan's family was hosting the welcome brunch. All reclaimed wood and modern chandeliers, soft jazz humming from hidden speakers. Nothing extravagant, just curated. Like everything they touched. The wall was covered in sepia-toned portraits of Charleston history, sea captains, cotton barons, early philanthropists. But in the center was a smaller frame, almost invisible. A candid shot, black and white, cropped tight. Two women. One was smiling with her eyes closed mid-laugh. The other, me, was looking down, glass of champagne in hand, oblivious to the lens. I remembered the event. A donor gala 6 years ago. Carly had insisted we take a real picture. Said she was tired of stiff poses. She'd chosen to frame this one. My name wasn't on the placard. Just Philanthropy Partners, 2018. No one here would recognize me from that photo now. My hair was longer, my expression older. The woman in the photo hadn't yet learned what silence could cost. Behind me, a familiar voice cut through the murmurs of brunch. "Vivian," I turned slowly. And there he was. Elliot Alden. Nathan's older brother. The one who never smiled with his mouth, only with half-raised eyebrows and measured pauses. The one who always said family is about the long game. Apparently so was revenge. Elliot looked me over as if assessing a fine wine someone forgot in the cellar. "Well," he said slowly, "Charleston just got a little more interesting." His voice hadn't changed, still crisp like cold metal. But there was something else now, a caution, maybe even respect. Didn't expect to see you here, he added, gesturing vaguely at the brunch crowd. Then again, no one ever really knows what you're planning. That was always your charm. I gave him a polite smile. I RSVP'd. He tilted his head. You RSVP'd and donated the chairs. That made me laugh quiet brief. I like people to sit comfortably, I said. Elliot stepped closer, his voice dropping. Margaret thinks you're here for closure. Nathan thinks you're here to cause a scene. And you, he studied me a second too long. I think you're here because power has a longer memory than love. That caught me. He wasn't wrong, but I wasn't going to hand him that truth on a silver tray. I'm here, I said calmly, because I was invited. Careful, Vivian. This family still eats its own. I'm not family anymore. He smiled at that, just the edges of his mouth. Exactly. He moved on before I could answer, leaving behind the scent of some expensive cologne and a warning dressed like courtesy. I turned back to the photo on the wall. Carly's smile stared back at me, all innocence and light. But I remembered the moment just after the shutter clicked, how she leaned in and whispered, "You make everyone feel so safe. Like nothing could ever fall apart." And then she did the very thing I never saw coming. She pulled the pin and smiled while it all burned. The brunch buffet wrapped around the side of the solarium, copper trays of quiche, candied bacon, and the obligatory shrimp and grits, because no Charleston gathering dared exclude it. Someone handed me a mimosa I didn't ask for. I held it untouched. Across the room, Carly moved through guests like a debutante on a farewell tour. White silk blouse, hair swept back, diamond studs, understated but deliberate. She had curated every inch of herself, and in a way I admired the discipline. Then she spotted me. For a second, just one, her smile stalled. But Carly was quick. She adjusted course mid-laugh and made her way over, arms open like this was some well-scripted reunion on morning television. Vivian, she cooed, drawing out the syllables. You look. She paused. Not out of uncertainty, but strategy. Then chose. Incredible. Thank you, I said, voice low and smooth. So do you. White suits you. There was a beat. We both knew the weight of that sentence. I'm so glad you came, she added, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. It means the world to Nathan. To Nathan, well, to both of us. She placed a delicate hand on my arm, just 2 fingers. Light like a dove landing on something that wasn't hers. I hope it's not strange you being here. We weren't sure if I wasn't either, I cut in. The hand slid away. I guess closure takes its own shape, I said, eyes still on hers. Of course, she breathed. And you deserve that. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I sipped the mimosa, then finally, though it tasted like oranges and lies. A waiter passed by with a tray of lavender scones, and Carly plucked one like she'd earned it. Did you get a chance to look at the photo wall, she asked casually, too casually. I did, I replied. She nibbled the edge of the scone, watching me for reaction. I insisted they include that one. You remember it, I remember that night. You were nervous about hosting the auction. Said your voice always shook during speeches. Carly's eyes lit with the memory. That's right, you told me to imagine the room already loved me. Did it help? Her smile faded just a hair. You always knew how to say the right thing. I let the silence linger. Then, you've built something impressive here, Carly. A new life. A new name soon, too. She bit her lip, a practiced gesture that once came off innocent. I just want everything to go smoothly, she said. There's been so much history. History tends to show up uninvited. Carly shifted her weight, suddenly unsure of her footing. Vivian, she began, more breath than voice. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. But someone did. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, not confrontational, just close enough that she had to hold my gaze. I'll see you at the rehearsal dinner, I said quietly. I'm told I'm seated near the head table. Then I turned before she could answer, walking away with measured steps through the hum of small talk and cutlery. Behind me, I felt her watching. Not just the woman she betrayed, but the woman she underestimated. Outside, the late morning light had turned sharp, dancing across the hoods of parked cars like it was auditioning for a memory. Ilias was waiting at the curb as usual, half reading something on his phone, the other half tuned into me the second I appeared. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at my face. Then, gently, "Was it everything you remembered?" "No," I said. "It was quieter." He opened the car door, but I hesitated. Across the street, in the hotel window, the photo wall caught the light again. Two women in grayscale. One believing she was loved. The other knowing too much to believe anything at all. As we pulled away, I reached into my bag and touched the small velvet pouch inside, the one I'd brought not for sentiment but strategy. Inside, it was a ring. Not mine, not Carly's. But the one Nathan had said was a mistake order all those years ago. The one he'd meant for someone else. It had never fit me. But somehow I always kept it. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Baymere Club, an old Charleston estate turned private dining hall, all wraparound porches and candlelit oak paneling. I'd been there once before, years ago, as someone's wife. Now I returned as someone's ghost. The valet handed me my clutch with a cautious smile, probably sensing the quiet tension stitched into the hem of my dress. Midnight navy. Clean lines. A neckline sharp enough to make a point but not a scene. Inside, the staff moved like shadows. Polished. Predictable. The place settings were done in bone-white china edged with platinum. And there it was right at the center of the long U-shaped table. My name, Vivian Hartstone. Written in perfect script nestled beside a single white orchid. They hadn't just set a seat for me. They'd placed me beside Margaret. I nearly laughed. Elias arrived minutes later, tugging slightly at his collar. He looked more like my lawyer than my date, which worked in our favor. "You're really going through with this," he murmured as he took the seat beside mine. "I RSVP'd," I said softly. It would be rude not to eat the meal. I let my fingers run along the silverware. Fork, knife, spoon, each one placed just right. Just like they always were when Margaret oversaw the table. This wasn't a dinner, it was a stage. And I knew every line they thought I'd forgotten. Margaret Alden arrived 10 minutes late. Of course she did. The room quieted, not completely, but enough for her entrance to register. That deliberate hush Charleston society gives to people who know how to wield it. She wore cream silk and a brooch that once belonged to Nathan's grandmother. Her smile was the same as always, wide, slow, and lined with meanings you couldn't question without sounding paranoid. When she saw me, she didn't flinch. She walked the length of the table with the elegance of someone who'd already rewritten the story in her head. Then she leaned and placed a kiss in the air near my cheek, and said just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "How brave of you to come." I smiled, cool and level. It felt important not to miss the rehearsal. Margaret's eyes flicked to Elias, then back to me. "And I see you've brought your business associate." "Only fair," I said. Nathan brought his. That earned a micro crack in her veneer. Barely. But I noticed. She took her seat and adjusted her napkin with surgical precision. "Well, tonight is about peace. About moving forward." I reached for my wine glass. "That's what I'm doing." The server poured a vintage Bordeaux, probably from the Alden family cellar. A subtle flex. So I let the glass sit. Margaret's voice dropped just enough to sound like intimacy. "You're not here to ruin his happiness, are you, Vivian?" "No," I replied. "That would be redundant." She froze mid-motion, just a flicker. Then, regaining composure, she said with a tight smile, "Some things are better left buried." "And some things," I said calmly, buttering a roll, refused to stay dead. Nathan arrived halfway through the salad course. No apology, no explanation, just a hand raised in casual greeting as if we were all old friends at a country club brunch. He wore navy and gold, perfectly tailored. Not a hair out of place. He looked good. Healthier than the last time I saw him, which made it worse somehow. He greeted Margaret with a kiss on the cheek, clasped hands with a few of the family friends, and finally let his eyes rest on me. "Vivian," he said, voice smooth. "You look like myself," I said, cutting him off. He blinked. Recalculated. I was just telling everyone how grateful we are that you came, he offered. Were you? I reached for the wine at last, sipping slow controlled. Then I must have missed that part. Elias remained quiet beside me, not tense, just aware. Like a man watching a chess match between opponents who'd already played each other too many times. Nathan leaned slightly across the table, elbows just off the linen. You didn't return my messages. No, I said. But I read them. Each one shorter than the last. That's a pattern, you know. Shorter messages, longer silences. His jaw tightened just briefly. I never wanted things to end the way they did. But they did, I said. And now you're marrying Carly. He said nothing. I added. 8 years ago I stood in the very cathedral you've booked. In a different dress. With the same doubts. But I suppose history is cheaper to remake than to repair. Nathan exhaled softly. You came here for something. What is it? I didn't blink. I came, I said, to return what was borrowed. The main course was duck confit with rosemary juice plated in the delicate swirl Margaret insisted on for any formal meal. I barely touched mine. Instead, I studied the dynamics unfolding. Carly sat across from me, her laugh just a hair too high, her touches on Nathan's arm a little too frequent. She glanced over once or twice, then fixed her gaze on the water glass in front of her. Nathan kept his attention split between Carly, between me and the table as a whole, like a man trying to host and defend a fortress at the same time. I let the silence grow longer between bites. When the server brought out a silver tray holding custom macarons with the couple's initials, I cleared my throat softly. May I asked, reaching toward the tray. The server nodded. I picked one macaron, rose and champagne flavored, if I remembered Carly's preferences correctly. Then from my bag, I produced a tiny folded card and set it on my bread plate. I turned to Nathan, my voice even. Do you remember when you told me everything would be different if we started over? He hesitated. I remember. Good, I said. Because I did start over. I pushed the card across the table toward him. He didn't open it, but his fingers curled around the edge. Beside me, Elias remained silent but alert. I don't need an apology, I said. Or explanation. But I will not be cast as your past while you stage a performance in a place built from borrowed memory. Carly's fork stopped midway to her mouth. Margaret's gaze had shifted to the card. Nathan's lips parted, but I raised a hand, graceful but firm. I'll leave you all to enjoy dessert, I said, standing. I've never had much of a sweet tooth anyway. I walked out onto the veranda without waiting for anyone to follow. The April air was soft, scented faintly with magnolia and salt. From here the marsh stretched toward the horizon, hushed and wide, like it was holding its breath. Footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. Elias's voice was low. You sure they got the message? They got enough of it, I said. The rest comes tomorrow. He handed me a small envelope, thicker than the one with the RSVP, thinner than the one I'd left on the table. Inside was the program for the wedding, freshly printed. I scanned it. The officiant. The readings. The musical selections. And there it was, third page in elegant cursive font, special remarks, Vivian Hartstone. They really thought I'd speak, I murmured. Elias gave a slight shrug. They built a narrative. You're just refusing to follow the script. I held the program against the railing, let the breeze tug at the edges. Then I smiled. Let them keep reading, I said. The real story hasn't started yet. Behind us inside the dining room, the silver USB drive sat quietly in my clutch, waiting. Special remarks, Vivian Hartstone. But the microphone she planned to use wasn't on the stage. It was in the sound booth. With the file named reception copy, play when prompted. The cathedral was colder than I remembered. St. Gabriel's never tried to impress with grandeur. Its beauty was in the restraint, stone walls smoothed by decades of hand sunlight filtering through tall panes of colored glass, and a hush that pressed against your chest the moment you crossed the threshold. I'd stood here once before, dressed in lace and hope, waiting for vows that wouldn't hold. Now I sat near the back in navy silk alone. The ushers tried not to stare. Some failed. Carly's college roommate passed by and hesitated long enough to whisper, "I didn't think you'd actually come." I gave her a polite nod. No more, let them wonder. Let them think I'd come out of bitterness, nostalgia, even desperation. No one guessed the truth. I wasn't there to stop the wedding. I was there to make sure it finished. The music shifted. A soft harp began to play. Elias slipped into the pew beside me, his expression unreadable. "Ready?" he asked, voice just above the hush. I adjusted my gloves. Almost. In the front pew, Margaret turned slightly, eyes scanning the crowd. She saw me. She didn't smile. The officiant took his place, the doors swung open. And Carly stepped in. She wore white satin, hair pulled into an artful knot, bouquet trembling slightly in her hand. For a split second I saw her as I once did, a girl eager to please, always watching others to know who to become. She looked radiant, she looked terrified. Then her eyes met mine. And something in her wavered. Not because I was there, but because she knew I knew. I leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, just enough for her to remember. I wasn't her ghost, I was her mirror. The ceremony moved forward like a carefully wound music box. Every word, every pause had been rehearsed. The priest's voice rose and fell with measured cadence. The guests responded on cue. Carly smiled when expected. Nathan held her hand like he'd practiced in the mirror. But I wasn't watching them. I was watching the sound booth. It sat high above the nave behind tinted glass. Most guests never even looked up there, but I knew who was inside. Earlier that morning, I'd handed the silver USB to the technician, a quiet man named Joel who'd once installed the sound system in one of my hotels. He didn't ask what was on it. He only asked, when I told him, when the priest says, "Before these witnesses." "That's your cue." He nodded. "Got it. You'll still want a mic?" I smiled. "Only if someone asks for a speech." Now sitting in the fourth pew from the back, I could see Joel's silhouette shift behind the glass. The moment was coming. The priest was nearing the vows. I could feel the hush settle deeper into the air, a weight on every shoulder in the room. Elias leaned toward me slightly, not touching, just anchoring his presence beside mine. "They think they're winning," I whispered. "They think this is the final chapter," he murmured back. "No," I said. "This is the prologue." In the front, Nathan adjusted his collar. His jaw tightened. He never liked long ceremonies. Carly's hands trembled, small controlled movements. She thought no one noticed. But I did. I always did. The priest raised his arms slightly. "Before these witnesses," Joel moved. And so did I. I stood. Deliberate. Steady. Every eye turned. But I wasn't walking to the altar. I was walking toward the aisle. Toward the back exit. Where the acoustics would carry my voice through the room when the audio began. The first few notes weren't music. They were silence, too sudden, too complete. Then came my voice. Recorded weeks ago. Calm. Precise. Irrefutable. This isn't a protest. This isn't a plea. This is a record. Of what was taken and who took it. Gasps rippled down the pews like wind moving through a field. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Joel had timed it perfectly, splicing audio clips, layering documents onto the cathedral projector as the recording continued. A subtle light shifted toward the chancel wall where images now began to appear: bank statements, shared passwords, emails from Carly's account to mine dated years ago. One photo, Carly holding my necklace in my bathroom while I was out of town. My voice still steady. She was not a stranger to me. She was a guest in my home. She borrowed dresses from my closet. She called me sister. I could hear someone crying. Maybe Margaret. I took another step forward, not to confront, but to observe. To see the moment. Realization spread like ink in water. Nathan turned pale. Carly's bouquet dropped. The priest stopped speaking entirely. I stopped at the base of the aisle, hands by my sides. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I let the silence after my voice fade into the tension it had created. Then the final lines of the recording played. You cannot build something sacred from someone else's ruin. Not unless you plan to be buried in it too. The file ended. No music followed, only breath. And disbelief. No one moved at first. Not the priest, not the bride, not even the man she was about to marry. Nathan's hand slowly released Carly's. She didn't try to hold on. In the back, someone stood. Then another. Whispered voices darted across the room, carrying questions without answers. A woman in a blue shawl began gathering her purse as if unsure whether she'd witnessed a ceremony or a scandal. I stayed where I was. Still. Watching. Letting them sit in it. Not just the embarrassment but the recognition. Of what they chose to ignore. Of what they helped create. Carly took a shaky step forward like she might still continue. Margaret rose from the pew, her lips moving but no sound coming out. The priest cleared his throat once, then looked down at the book in his hands as if it might tell him what to do next. It didn't. And that was the thing. This part of the story had never been written. Because no one had expected me to write it. Elias stood at the edge of the aisle, now waiting, not pushing, not coaxing. Just ready. I met his eyes for a moment and nodded slightly. I turned without a word. And walked out. The door closed behind me with a soft click, almost reverent. Like the cathedral itself had accepted the ending. Outside, the wind off the water met me with something close to kindness. I breathed it in. Not relief, not victory. But gravity settling into a space that had once held nothing but ache. Then I heard it. Quick footsteps behind me. One pair, running. Vivian, wait. I didn't stop right away. I let the voice land first. Let it carry the weight it deserved. Then I turned. Nathan stood on the church steps, jacket undone. Tie crooked, the groom's boutonniere still pinned to his lapel like some cruel parody of celebration. He looked like a man waking up in the middle of someone else's story. You planned this, he said, breathless but not angry. Not yet. I prepared, I corrected. You don't get to call it revenge just because you never expected consequences. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes darting to the doors behind him, then back to me. I didn't know about all that. You didn't want to know. A silence stretched between us, long enough for both of us to hear the faint hum of the harbor, the low call of gulls overhead, the murmurs still rising inside the cathedral. You could have just stayed away, he said, softer now. Moved on. I did, I said. You're confusing silence with forgiveness. He blinked and I saw the moment land. That this wasn't a plea to get him back. It wasn't even about him, it was about me. About the woman he thought he left behind. Viv, he tried this. Ruins everything. No, I said quietly. This just shows what was already broken. He didn't speak again. I didn't wait. I turned, heels clicking gently against the old stone path, and walked toward the waiting car where Elias sat behind the wheel. When I reached the door, I paused, not for effect but to breathe. To feel the fullness of the moment settle into my bones. Then I slid into the passenger seat. Elias didn't ask what happened. He just handed me a paper cup. Coffee. Still warm. I sipped it slowly, watching the cathedral shrink in the side mirror as we pulled away. Sometimes justice doesn't sound like applause. It sounds like your own breath, steady and sure, and for the first time in years. Mine was. The next morning, Charleston smelled like spring rain and fresh jasmine. I stood barefoot in my kitchen, listening to the gentle tap of drizzle against the tall windows. The harbor was silver. The world somehow softer than the day before. And inside me a quiet I hadn't felt in years. No more invitations, no more pretending, no more looking back. The wedding made the headlines, of course. Not for the flowers. Not for the dress. But for the woman who walked out with the truth. Someone had recorded the audio from the cathedral. Posted it to a local blog before noon. By evening, it was everywhere. Carly's PR firm issued a statement about privacy and distortion. Nathan, ever strategic, made no comment. Margaret Alden was reportedly under the weather. And me, I went to the florist and bought myself lilies. I scheduled a massage. I answered no calls except one from a woman I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Her name was Janelle. We'd worked together once when I was just starting out. She'd taught me how to say no with a smile and make it stick. Her voice on the phone was smoky and amused. "Well, hell," she said. "That was you, wasn't it?" I didn't confirm or deny. Janelle chuckled. "I'm just calling to say about damn time. You always were too elegant to disappear quietly." We talked for an hour, about nothing, about everything. And when I hung up, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Nathan, not at Carly. Not even at the version of me who once thought loyalty meant silence. That afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds like an apology. Warmth spilled across my living room floor, turning the hardwood into soft amber. I had just folded the last clean linen into a drawer when the phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail at first, old habit, but something about the silence afterward made me curious. I played the message. "Mrs. Hartstone, this is Melanie Wolfe from Charleston Women's Leadership Forum. We'd love to speak with you about your story, yes, but also about what you've built since." She paused. "More women need to hear voices like yours. If you're willing to share." I stood still for a long moment, holding the phone against my chest. It had always been easier to disappear. To build my life in glass and steel and keep the doors locked tight. But that call, it wasn't about Nathan. Not really. It was about everything after him. I called her back. We spoke plainly. No press. No spotlight. "Just a room of women," she said. "Some survivors, some still stuck in the before. They wanted someone who'd walked through the fire and didn't come out angry but awake." "When's the event?" I asked. "Next Saturday," she said. "The old Turner house off Broad." I smiled. I'd passed that house 100 times. It always looked like it was waiting for someone to tell the truth inside its walls. "All right," I said. "Count me in." The Turner house sat just off Broad Street, tucked behind a garden of wild roses and a fountain that no longer ran. I arrived early. The floors creaked with age, but the space felt honest. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains. Folding chairs circled a central table dressed with coffee urns and ceramic cups. No stage, no microphones. Just presence. A few women trickled in. Some smiled. Others nodded with the kind of recognition that didn't need words. One leaned over and whispered, "You're her, right?" I just smiled. Not confirming. Not denying. The session began without ceremony. A woman named Rhonda opened by reading a poem, something about letting go without needing revenge. A few sniffles followed. Then silence. Then one woman stood to speak. Then another. And another. No cameras. No bios. Just stories. When it was my turn, I stood. No notes. No script. "I used to think leaving quietly was strength," I said. "That dignity meant disappearing. But it turns out silence isn't grace, it's permission." A few heads nodded slowly. "I didn't burn bridges," I continued, "but I stopped holding them up alone. And that was enough. No applause, no headlines. But I saw it in their eyes. A kind of release. A mirror reflecting something back they hadn't named yet. Not survival, sovereignty." It was almost dusk when I got home. The harbor shimmered in gold, soft waves brushing against the docks like a whisper that didn't need to be heard to be felt. I poured myself a glass of water, no wine tonight. Just clarity. Then the phone rang. I recognized the number. I hadn't seen it in years, but I remembered it. The way you remember the sound of your own name even when no one said it kindly in a long time. It was my father. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, not really. Just one stiff card every Christmas. A signature. Nothing else. I hesitated. Then picked up. His voice was older than I remembered. Thinner, like wind through a screen door. "Vivian," he said, "I saw something on the news." Of course he had. Everyone had. There was a pause. "You did it clean," he said finally. "Didn't shout, didn't beg, you just stood." I leaned against the kitchen counter, unsure what to say. "I wasn't much of an example," he added. "Your mother and I, we made noise when we ended." Broke things we didn't mean to. I thought maybe silence would protect you. It didn't, I said gently. But I learned anyway. Another pause. Then something like breath. I'm proud of you, kid. It wasn't enough to fix anything. But it was something. And for once that something didn't sting. A week later, I went back to the cathedral. No cameras. No ceremony, just me. The groundskeeper gave me a small nod when I asked to walk the aisle. Inside the place looked different without flowers. Without expectation. Without him. I sat in the very back row where no one ever notices the woman in the shadow of stained glass, and I breathed. For a long time I had mistaken forgiveness for forgetting. But here's what I know now: you don't have to forget. You don't even have to forgive. You just have to walk through the door and not look back. Before I left, I placed something at the foot of the altar. A velvet pouch. Inside the ring. Not mine. Not Carly's. The one meant for someone who never existed. I left it there without a note. No one would know where it came from. No one needed to. Outside, the Charleston breeze moved through my hair like memory learning how to let go. And as I walked down the steps, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel broken. I felt done, not with love. Not with hope. Just done with pretending I needed to be anything less than exactly who I'd become. Vivian Hartstone. Not Mrs. Nathan Alden. And this time no one would need a label to know it. Some endings don't come with applause. They come with breath, calm, steady, finally, your own. I didn't ruin a wedding. I reclaimed a truth. And I did it without shouting, without revenge. Just facts delivered in silence and steel. Because sometimes the strongest voice is the one that refuses to stay silent just to keep others comfortable. My name is Vivian Hartstone. And I wasn't the villain in their story. I was the author of my own. Have you ever had to speak the truth when everyone wanted you quiet? Tell me in the comments, I'll be reading. And if you believe closure doesn't have to look like revenge but can still be unforgettable, hit subscribe, share this story, and don't forget, you're allowed to write your own ending.